Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited about this session. And let me give you a little background on the person, but not necessarily on the work. And I'll let Glenda explain what she's been doing for many years. And Glenda and I met recently in Iceland at the Spirit of Humanity conference, which happens every few years. And it's an invitational conference that's deliberately organized to get people from different walks of life and different organizations to come together. There are about 100 of us from all over the world. And it's really quite an exciting opportunity because it allows for network opportunities that happen over lunchtime or dinner or on a bus ride somewhere. And so we're excited to have Glenda with us. And when she first explained what it is that she's been doing, and she mentioned wicked issues, and I said, oh my God, we need to have wicked issues as a kind of process. Just because so many of our partners in our cities, and let's face it, even the charter itself as an organization encounters these stumbling blocks that kind of halt us and kind of stop us. So I invited Glenda as an opportunity to just chat and see, have her do a presentation where we really can get to the heart and soul of what she's doing so we can make decisions about how we might interface with Glenda and her group in the future. So Glenda has a challenging last name when you see it written out. And Glenda, maybe you should write it out so people can see.
I will indeed.
Eoyang, and so, but it's spelled differently than it's pronounced. And so, Glenda, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Marilyn, thank you so much. And for your wonderful work. It was great to get to know you and your corner of your community while we were together. So I'm really happy to be with all of you. I'm coming to you from the headwaters of the Mississippi River in the United States. And it's a beautiful autumn day outside. And so when we first decided to meet today, I forgot that last night would be Halloween. So it seems very funny that we're talking about Wicked issue on All Saints Day. So I hope you brought your wicked ones with you. I've been doing work at the intersection of complexity in human systems since the late 1980s. And at that time, I realized that there were some problems that were not being solved by the methods and models I had. So I'd studied leadership, I'd studied facilitation, I'd studied computer science, philosophy, history of science, and I was just running into some problems that I did not know how to handle. So I began to research what was going on. Why were those challenges of uncertainty and complexity so overwhelming to me and my teams and my communities? And one of the first things I discovered was a paper that came in 1976. It was written before many of you were born, by Riddle and Weber, and they were two urban planners. And in the mid 70s, there was a lot of confidence. In fact, I'd say a little hubris in the social sciences about if we were good enough scientists, we could solve all our social systems issues. Those of you who don't remember that have probably read about those wonderful days when we thought we could solve everything. But Riddle and Weber realized in their work that there were some issues that simply would never be solved. And they called those wicked issues. And they include things like poverty, social justice, and just the acknowledgement for them that even though we can take action and shift those problems, we would never be able to solve them. And that insight was enough for them in that time Since then, we've realized there are more and more wicked issues. And I don't know whether it's because we've solved the simple ones or have pathways to solve the simple ones, so we don't have to worry about them anymore, or whether wicked ones really have become more and more wicked. But with the coming of complexity science, with the coming of insights of interdependencies, new ways to collaborate, new ways to think about and interact with community, it became more and more urgent that we find some way to engage with these unsolvable problems. Just saying that we can't solve them is not enough. And so, as I think about the wonderful work that all of you do in communities and that your networks do in those communities, there are many issues that we will never be able to solve. And yet, you make progress, you invest your life source in making difference. And so, how can we do that together and give ourselves hope and possibility, even when we're working with things that are not solvable? So, I'm going to invite each of you just to select a wicked issue to be thinking about today, one that keeps you awake at night, one that you've been working on maybe for years. Maybe it's one that you think you had solved last year, but then it came unsolved this year. We're going to zero in on that. One of the things that we've discovered is that there are ways to think about and engage with those issues that make a tremendous difference. So what I want to do is to talk just a little bit about where they come from and why they're so wicked. And then to share with you 3 pretty fundamental tools that we use that help us engage with wicked issues, not solve them, but engage with them. And I'm going to invite you to use those 3 tools today while we're together to practice on those issues. As we're doing it, what I'd like for you to do just to begin, so I get a sense of you and where you are, if you would, in the chat space, say who you are, where you are, and what's one word that describes the state that you feel in now, your current weather that you're feeling, just to get a sense of the room. Who are you? Where are you? And what's your weather now? Great, thank you. Hmm. Yeah. Thank you. There's a sense of heaviness, isn't there? Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that and for being in community with us today, bringing our heavy hearts and heavy hands together. Thank you for sharing. In 2019, our community did a futuring process to see what support the world would need in 2051. And the one thing we saw for sure was that there would be a period of great difficulty and challenge as we did our environmental scan. And what we realized our work would be in some way to help people build the adaptive capacity they need, we all need, to thrive in spite of that. And out of that time came a vision for our human systems dynamics community, which is this: that people everywhere thrive because we see patterns clearly, we seek to understand, and we act with courage to transform turbulence and uncertainty into possibility for all. I'll send that to you in writing later. And we find that it's not just a vision for the far future, though it is a vision for there as well, but it's a vision that we bring into our present moment so that in this time together, that's my hope for you, is that we can see patterns clearly, seek to understand and act with courage to transform the turbulence and uncertainty that we're all feeling so deeply today into possibility. So thank you for being with us. I'd like for this, since we're such a small group, for us this to be as interactive as possible. Please feel free to open your mic and speak up, or raise your hand, or put something in chat. Marilyn's going to be watching the chat for us. But please feel free, if something sparks in you a question or an insight or touches something for you, please feel free to share. Is there anything else that we need to say? Oh, I'm going to invite our confidentiality in this space. I believe that this recording may be shared with others. I invite you to share only what you'd be comfortable sharing more broadly. We'll have a breakout toward the end, and that will not be recorded. But I just want to let you know to be careful with your own stories and others so that you're sharing just as much as you feel comfortable sharing in this community. All right. So let us dive in. So we talk about simple practices for complex times. Often people think the more complex the world is, the more complicated your solutions need to be. And my experience in the real world is that that does not work. That if I'm working in really complex times and things are moving quickly and I'm being drawn in many, many directions, the last thing I have time to do is to stop and do a detailed systems analysis. It just doesn't happen. So I need tools that I can pick up and use, that I can share with other people, that I can move forward quickly. And so those are the kinds of tools and models that we have developed in human systems dynamics and that we'll be sharing with you today. I want you to feel free. Whatever you learn from us belongs to you. Feel free to use it, share it widely and openly. We do not protect our intellectual property. We want it to go as far and fast as possible. So these simple tools, they're not always easy to use, but they are simple. And so to share them as widely as you might care to. So this is one of my favorite Einstein quotes, that you can never solve a problem at the same level at which it was created. And so we know the wicked issues that we're working with were created by many of the solutions that we've implemented in the past. They were good at the time, they did good at the time, and yet there are ways in which those solutions are trapping us now. I think the Middle East is a perfect example. A solution that was a solution at one time has now manifested itself as a problem, and we will not be able to solve it from that same space. I also find in my own career that there are ways in which I get caught with what I either can do or think I can do or should do. And that as long as I'm in that particular mindset, I can't break through it, but I shift to another level and then I can. So as we're talking today, we'll be going up and down the level of systems, from what's happening inside you, the wicked issues that you may experience yourself. I, for one, have a wicked issue of weight, continues to emerge, and relationships, professional and personal, teams, institutions, communities, and global issues. So at all levels of human interaction, we see these same patterns showing up as wicked issues. So we'll be zooming up and down that level of abstraction. So, what's the challenge today? Why do we have so many wicked issues? Why are we feeling stuck in so many ways, in so many places? Well, one of the distinctions we like to make is between what we call finite games, which give us tame issues, and infinite games that give us wicked issues. Now, a finite game is like hockey or football. There are rules, there are boundaries to it. You know, who are the opponents and who are your colleagues? There's a coach, there's a referee. It begins and it ends in a finite game, and somebody wins, and that's the way a project should be, and tame issues. Many of our colleagues work with evaluation, and we think about evaluation as a finite game where there are objectives. Did you reach them? Did you not? So that's one way of engaging with the world and the challenges that sit there. The other is an infinite game, which is open. Boundaries are open. Things are coming in and out all the time. There are lots of variables, lots of different ways to measure success. And the causality is nonlinear. You can never really tell where the root cause sits. And these are two different types of issues and questions that you deal with. So if you think about over the last week, the challenges that you faced, some of them were finite games. You could just do them and solve them. And some of them were much different in kind. So for finite games, there's a kind of certainty to them. We've seen them before. We can predict what's going to happen. But in the infinite games, the games like falling in love, games like employee engagement, games like compassion. Compassion is surprising. They're also either closed, bounded, or open. And so I believe that one of the reasons why your work at the Charter for Compassion is so powerful is that you live and work in this infinite game frame where the openness of compassion is the heart of it and also the challenge of it. Finite games are familiar. You know them, you've played them, there's expertise that goes along with them. But an infinite game is always novel. Each time it's unique. Each compassionate engagement is new. They have a single root cause for a finite game, and a problem solving is let's find a root cause and fix it. In an infinite game, there are many, many causes, and none of them is a root. Any one of them is a possible lever into the change, but none of them is final. Every finite game has a beginning and an end. So you can say this project has a start date and an end date, or this budget has a start date or an end date. But in an infinite game, it's continuing. So if you think about the cultures in your communities, whether it's a culture of violence or the emerging culture of compassion, those are ongoing. There are in all of your communities, in the communities of Israel and Gaza, deep patterns of compassion as well as violence. And those are continuing without beginning or end. Finite games live in answers. Let's find the answer. Let's know what it is. And infinite games live in really rich and beautiful questions. And finding those questions and seeing what those questions are is the work that you do. Now, I'm expecting that when I describe infinite game here, it's not a surprise to you. I'm suspecting that this is a world that's very familiar. And so we can name it, so we can hold it in a shared way and understand its dynamics. I'm just going to go ahead and put the rest of these here so you can see. So we can, in finite games, say, well, we've got a problem, let's solve it. And that can be very satisfying. When you can do that, it's lovely. In an infinite game, there are not problems that can be solved. But if we see them as patterns, they can be shifted. So if we think about the violence, even in our own communities, not as a problem that we're going to solve once and for all, but if we think about it as a pattern that exists, it exists differently with children, with adults, with one part of the community, another part of the community. They are patterns. And what can we do then to shift them? And I believe that that's where your great gifts come in your Charter for Compassion and the work that you do in your cities and communities, is that you, in your engagement, are pattern shifters. So I'm curious about some examples of what are some finite or infinite games. I'm going to stop sharing here for a moment. As you think about your life and work, all these scales, personal all the way up to global, what are some of the finite games that you work with? You can either speak up or put it in chat. What are some of the finite games that occupy your time?
I would say working with organizations because they tend to be, in some cases, quite finite when you're dealing with strategic plans and outcomes and areas like that. So they can be pretty set and certain things that don't change.
Absolutely. I do a lot of work with healthcare and with banking. And those are two institutions that have always been very finite game structured. And yet today they're trying to be more flexible, trying to be more community oriented, trying to be more diverse. And they're having trouble breaking out of those finite game rules and structures. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What else?
I'd say probably any event that you might be involved in. I'm thinking, locally of like the Halloween party. There might be some stumbling blocks, but for the most part, it has that beginning and ending, and we've always done it this way. And maybe we can do it a little differently, but it's still going to happen. Um, so anything like that.
Yeah, it's a great example. And it's a place where you can see incremental improvement, right? You're going to do it over. It's going to be pretty much the same. We're going to do it a little better next time. And so you can do incremental improvement over time. Excellent. Can we have one more example?
Elections.
Exactly. We hope, don't we? Yeah. So it's so interesting that we have the rule of law and the election process that is so clear, or has been in the past. And this is one of the things that we see where the turbulence comes, when something that we have assumed was finite, predictive game suddenly gets disrupted and becomes much less predictable. So unpredictable that we end up with January 6th here in the US. Yeah. So I hope that the next election is as predictable as it should be. That's great. What are some of the examples of infinite games that you play, patterns that you engage with, that you shift, you see them change, but you never really expect them to be completely solved?
So, Glenda, can I just interrupt here? I'm just wondering, can a finite issue make its way into being a wicked issue?
So it's quite interesting. So it is, in a wicked issue, you may have finite issues within it, or you may have a large finite issue that if you zoom in, it's wicked. But finite issues, by definition, are addressable by usual problem solving techniques. That you can divide it up into parts, you can solve the parts, you can put them back together. So that's, by definition, a finite one is ready to be solved. They're not always easy to solve, but they are solvable. You can also see the same challenge through the finite lens or through the infinite lens. So I once worked with a fellow who was a futurist in Halifax, and one of the things he did was to coach his girls' soccer team. And there were 12-year-old girls, and he was coaching the team, and they were really good, master team. And he would, during the game, really help them work hard and be accountable and do their best and compete during the game. And after the game, Jack would forget who won. He'd forget the score. Somebody would say, "Who won the game last night?" He said, "I don't know. They did a really good job. All the kids did a really good job." And so he found a way to take that sports experience and to make it finite beginning to end. And yet, when he looked at the arc of his children's lives, it was an infinite game. Yes, you have your hand raised. Mm-hmm.
I have been thinking a lot about many of the social services agencies that happen. And I am thinking that they are trying to make the wicked problems finite in order to address issues and also to ensure their funding and their continuation. So it's I've been trying to do some analysis of our systems, and I see these different sectors, and I've been contrasting service agencies with service clubs, and your list of what they are, like, yeah, that's it. So I just wanted to make that comment that I think so often, I've often said it's trying to put a square peg in a round hole is sometimes what's happening, but that's just something that I'm just dwelling on these days. So any comments would be appreciated.
That's a great insight. Absolutely. And one of the things that happens is that we have judgments about each other. So the people who are really good at the finite game have judgments about the infinite game. They're tender-hearted, they're not committed, they're blah, blah, blah. And the other way, those of us who love to work in the compassionate infinite game think that the others are kind of hard-hearted and cold. The most important thing in a complex system is that we value both. We know they both have to be there. We have to be able to play both of them and find the one that's most fit for function in a time and place. And so bringing them both together without judgment, but with clarity of fit. So yes, a lot of the work we've done is with social service agencies and trying to bring together the people who handle, let's say, foster care and financial aid, to very different stances and perspectives, and to help them see a way to work together. That's a perfect example. Yes, ma'am.
Nancy.
Nancy,
thank you. Yes, I appreciate this. I'm learning so much already. It occurs to me that prejudice would fall under an infinite game, as I get to work with the Charter on social justice sector, and it seems unsolvable.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's interesting that affirmative action was a finite way to try to address that infinite game. And of course, opinions vary. I don't know what yours is about how well it did that. But there's a time in which a finite game can be set up and it will work for a while, but there's a point at which you start getting negative consequences from it. And so a different finite game can bring a different pair. So one of the things in an infinite game is just to keep generating useful finite games that will keep you moving forward. But I think prejudice is a perfect example. And one of the reasons why much anti-bias training does not work very well, because in order to train about it, we make it finite, and then we're not really talking about what it is. We're not really talking about it. Thank you. Okay, so are we ready to dive in? So what I'd like for you to do is to think about a wicked issue that you'd like to think about today, one that you'd like to dive into. Just make sure that we're going in the right place. And just pick one, and it can be small, medium, or large. It would be helpful if it's something that you can touch in some way. And I'd like for you to write 3 sentences about it. So I'll give you a couple of minutes, just 3 sentences, no more than that, about your wicked issue.
Sorry, could we have the previous slide on again?
Oh, sure. Yes, ma'am. I think. Yes, you can.
That one.
Yeah, there you go. Mhm.
Thank you.
You're welcome. About 10 more seconds to finish up. Excellent. Does anyone need more time? So I know that it's not easy to take a very large wicked issue that you've been dealing with for a long time, that is overwhelming, and to telescope it into 3 sentences. But once you have done that, you have captured the essence of the pattern in this moment. It's not the whole thing. It certainly may not even be the most important things, but they are figural evidence of this issue that make it feel and seem more finite so that you can begin to touch it. At the same time, in the back of your mind, you know it's an infinite game. So if you'll take those 3 sentences, just set them over to the side. We'll be coming back to them in a moment. I also want to point out that infinite games are not always destructive. My marriage was an infinite game. In fact, even after my husband passed, it's still an infinite game continuing. Friendships, family, tradition is an infinite game. Commitment is an infinite game. And so we tend to focus on the negative, destructive ones, but infinite games are also the place where our great energy and possibility emerge. So if you can't solve them, there you've got it. Not going to be solved. If you can't solve it, what can you do? And there are 3 principles that we're going to share today. In human systems dynamics, we have about 35 tools and models and methods that we use various places and times. But these are 3 that are kind of core that we find most useful. And I want to share them with you today and give you a chance to apply them and see what happens with your pattern shifting. So the first one is called adaptive action. The second, sorry, let me stop this somehow. Adaptive action. The second is about inquiry. And the third is what we call pattern logic. So we're going to dive into each of these specifically. And they are useful because they work in systems that are open and unpredictable, where there are a lot of variables you can't predict, and where the interactions and causality is not clear. These are optimized for working in situations like that. So, adaptive action. This may look familiar as a learning cycle or a problem-solving cycle. It's not all that different from the Total Quality Plan, Do, Study, Act, PDSA cycle. But it helps us see patterns with the what, understand them clearly with the so what, and then do something with the now what. So what's present in the here and now, not what do we wish or what have we thought or what might or whatever, not getting lost in all of that, but as concretely and specifically and objectively as you can say, what's the current situation? What is happening right now? What? Second question is, so what? So what holds possibility in this moment? So what is there in this moment that might have the energy to make a difference? So what? And once you see that, then now what will you do? To amplify, to optimize, to speed up, to press that possibility. And then once you take that action, then the pattern shifts and you're in the next cycle of what, so what, now what. I am not in any way an expert in the Middle East, but in talking with friends who are there, this question about what is the present situation? So what is possible? The great empathy that is felt by individuals in the space on both sides of the line and all around and here and everywhere. There's something about that human to human empathy which is held. And many of my friends are saying, if that's a possibility, what can I or we do to optimize that empathy, to shift the pattern wherever we are? What? So what? Now what? There's several things about this. One is that it's so simple, anybody can do it. We have associates who are kindergarten teachers, and they teach their kids adaptive action so that the kindergartners are teaching each other how to read. What are they seeing? So what does that mean they're understanding? Now what can we do? And so they do adaptive action to teach each other how to read. And we use it for large-scale strategic planning for agricultural programs in Africa. What's the data? So what are the multiple options in multiple places? Now what can we do? And the trick here is that you don't have to do a now what that solves the problem. You don't have to find the right now what or some big now what, the perfect now what. What you need is just something that you can do concretely that will shift the pattern. You don't know how it's going to shift it, but you just do something. What? So what? Now what? So I'm going to stop sharing here for a minute and ask, if this looks so easy, what, so what, now what? And intuitively, I'm sure you do this all the time, every time you solve a problem. If you're a parent, for sure you've done it. What, so what, now what? Where does it get stuck? So do you ever get stuck on what? On the what step? Ever get stuck on what? What does that look like? My government friends, my bureaucracy friends get stuck on what a lot. Bring me some more data. I need more data. We can't make a decision yet. Bring me more data. Of course, they're not looking at the data, but they need more data. Yeah. They're stuck in what? They think if they get enough data, then the right action will show up. But in a complex system, you can never get all the data. The system is open. There's always new data. You'll never get it all. What you need is just enough to start seeing a so what. Does that make sense? Yeah. And as you're thinking about your colleagues and the other people who work on your wicked issue with you, are there some of them who are stuck on what? Yeah, I had a board once that just like would not get off what. Second. So then, so what? You can also get stuck in so what. That's what we call analysis paralysis. If I just look at this another way, if I just think through it another way, if I just get another expert in, if I just read another book, it will come to me, you know. And then we're stuck. And there's no way you're going to be able to figure it all out. It's a wicked issue. There are lots of factors, lots of parts, lots of perspectives, lots of possible approaches. Which one can you take? So what? And we spend so much time arguing about which is the right so what. So if you take racism, is that an economic issue? Is it an issue of education? Is it an issue of history? Is it an issue of commitment culture? Well, let's fight about which one that is, why we don't do anything to make a difference. When if we just say, if I think it's an educational issue, now what would I do? If you think it's a cultural issue, now what would you do? If you think it's economic, go for it, right? And then we have multiple pathways in to shift that pattern when we give up thinking one of them's going to solve it. Does that make sense? And so that pathway. So when we come together in community and try to find the right path where we think we all have to be on the same path to get things done, that's the death knell for complex change. Now you need a shared goal, vision out there. It can be pretty ambiguous. You need to say you're climbing the same mountain, but you don't all have to take the same path up it. Let somebody use their pitons at the edge and somebody else take a wheelchair around and around and around. But we're all going the same place. And it's that variation that allows us really to shift the patterns over time. That's the so what. And we get stuck in now what because we think we have to have the right thing. That we're not going to do anything until we can predict what's going to be the result. We will never predict the result in a complex system. We will always be surprised. So you might as well do it around quickly so you can be surprised quickly and respond again quickly and see what that cycle shifts over time. Getting stuck and getting unstuck. So I'm curious, as you think about adaptive action, your 3 sentences, by the way, for your wicked issue is your what. That's your what. So as you think about the so what, as you look at those 3 sentences, is there a possibility that you see in those 3 sentences, a possibility for an opening, something that isn't completely stuck or may not be as stuck as you think it is? And what might be something you could do to press on that place in that pattern? So I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes to think about that, and then we'll talk about inquiry. I need to check the time too. All righty. So I'm hoping we're going to generate a lot of possible options for action. In an adaptive action, you do not end up with a list. We are not going for a list of actions. Have you ever finished a meeting and there's a long list? You know you're never going to get to them, but you commit anyway and you come back to the next meeting and explain why you didn't get to them. Mm-hmm. I've been in that meeting. Have you? Mm-hmm. Right. It's much more effective to say, there's this one thing that I'm going to try and I'm going to see what happens. And when I come back next week or next day, I'll let you know what happened. So it becomes an experiment. So you're learning and acting all the time. In fact, when I first started doing this work, I'd generate a list and I'd say, okay, I'll do the first thing in an adaptive action on the list, and I would do it. Then I'd come back at the next meeting. Nothing else on the list was relevant anymore because the pattern had shifted. so much that they didn't even make any sense anymore. And so that idea about just continuing to be engaged with what's possible. All right, so that's adaptive action. And I invite you to think about the ways that you already do it, that you lead your teams to do it, that you see your communities doing it. And if you can make it explicit and it becomes a shared practice rather than your individual way you do business, then it can really leverage others and teach others so that you're all adaptive actioning along together. Oh, one other warning. You can't do anybody else's adaptive action. You can only do your own. Now, yours may be influencing somebody else's pattern to do their adaptive action. But if you get to the now what and it's somebody else's work, start over again because you're not in a good place. You can only do your own. Ironically enough, that's part of the reason why it's so hopeful, such a hopeful strategy. Okay, so I know we've only got 90 minutes, and so let's go to inquiry. Notice that each of these is not a command or an expectation, it's a question. What? So what? Now what? So that when you come face to face with a complex system that's one you do not understand, do not control, cannot predict, you come to it in inquiry. And that inquiry then gives you the humility, the openness to be able to engage. So I've got two tools for inquiry. So let's look at the first one. The first one's called the power of questions. And in this, you begin with your 3 sentences. That's the what part. And the second step, the so what, is that you listen to questions without answering them. Now, the questions are open-ended. They're not disguised advice. It's not like, have you thought about seeing a therapist? That is not a question. And there's something that the asker doesn't know the answer to. And so you just listen to the questions and let them wash over you. No answers allowed. And then the last step is to say, so what is one thing you might do? A next wise action based on what you heard. So this is called the power of questions. We did it for 3 years, Monday through Friday, every day. We started in the middle of COVID. And usually we just have anyone in the room share questions that they want to ask. But today we'll do it a little bit differently because it will be faster and still pretty powerful. So I'd like for you to take your 3 sentences, hold them in front of you, take a really deep breath, and blow it out. And I'm just going to ask you 10 questions. And I'd like for you just to sit with your wicked issue in the soup of these questions and see what emerges for you. Are you ready? So what's at the center of this wicked issue and what's at its edge? If you think about the person who's at the opposite from you on this wicked issue, what's one thing you'd want to ask them? When you think about this wicked issue, where do you feel it in your body? Just take a deep breath and think about it. Where does it constrain your body? Breathing, What was the first moment you were aware of this wicked issue? What was the first moment? And do you remember what happened right before that? If this wicked issue were a dance, what kind of a dance would it be? Is it disco? Is it a waltz? Is it a square dance? Is it hip hop? Break dancing? What kind of a dance would it be? what does love have to do with it? How does this challenge exist within you, not just outside of you? Or if it manifests inside, how does it show up outside of you? How would you describe this wicked issue to a 6-year-old? If you think of every hero in history, who would you want to ask about this wicked issue? And if you could time travel out 20 years, what's the story that you'd like to tell yourself about this moment? So I'll give you another few seconds just to settle in to what you're seeing. Okay. So I have 2 questions. One is, what was the impact of that, receiving those questions in your wicked issue? What was the sensation or perspective or insight you had? And second, was there any shift in the wicked issue? So would somebody be willing and able to share a little bit? How did it affect you? How did it affect the issue? Yes, please.
Hi.
Okay.
So just to start off with, the wicked issue that I wrote down to explore during this session is procrastination. And as you were talking, I was realizing that, like, as much as I think I have a really big procrastination problem, I also describe myself as someone who is a doer. So it's like, it just doesn't make sense that I have this, that procrastination is my big problem when I'm like, I get so much, like I can get a lot done in a shorter amount of time. And just some of the, like, as we're talking and I'm listening, um, how does this impact people who are perfectionists, right? When you're talking about, your answer or whatever your step 3 is, doesn't have to be the perfect answer. I'm like, but okay, and to be able to let go and just try just one thing instead of, because I have this, like, I always think, oh, I've got to do all of these things, but just to have one thing, like for me, I feel hopeful. So yeah, thank you.
That is so great. So what's in now what you're going to try?
I think, like, to be more gentle with myself and try not to worry so much about the 1 or 2 things that I might not be getting done. Right? Like, somebody mentioned something about jet lag. I think, was it Lynn? And like, my husband and I just got back from New Zealand last week, and I had jet lag like for 4 or 5 days, and today, like, I actually feel like myself again. Thank goodness. But to just be more gentle. Yeah.
That's so cool. And if you can take that and make it concrete, so like think of a gentle sentence you would like to hear in that moment and write it on a piece of paper and tape it on the wall. So the more concrete you can make that now what, the more effective it's going to be.
Yes,
Yeah, cool. That's great. Anyone else want to share? Thank you so much for sharing. How did it feel just to hear the questions coming at you?
I'll share a little bit, Glenda, if you don't mind. My wicked issue that I put down is a really simple one. It's violence. And those questions really helped me center and also gave me a sense of hope that through this procedure, this process or analysis, that I can focus on something. I can identify an area, and I'm thinking specifically of nonviolent communication, which I've been studying recently, and I can find ways to help share what I'm learning with other people about the use of violent words like bullet points and triggers. And I recognize that much of my sense of this being a wicked issue is personal, having had an act of violence involving guns in my life. And if I feel that I could make progress with any number of people regarding those terms and the activators that they are, I feel like that would be a finite game and would allow me to hopefully move forward into other areas. So thank you for creating this space and this sharing this process.
So glad. Thank you for sharing that. Often when we ask questions, we're trying to zoom in. We're playing a finite game, trying to zoom in on the right answer. And so we get narrower and narrower and narrower. If you can't answer the questions, then it's possible for them to expand the space. And so you really literally have more freedom to explore what's possible because the space gets larger and larger. I'll send you a link to some videos for, we did it 900 times with different wicked issues from different places. I'll send you a link and you can go in and see them. It is, I find it quite a transforming process. And back to the finite game. So that's the power of questions. As you can see, it's simple. Try it. You can't hurt. The second tool with inquiry is what we call the rules for inquiry. And we knew for a long time that inquiry was important in complexity and uncertainty, that inquiry is basically all you've got. Answers have a really short shelf life, but questions last a long time. But people would ask us, well, how do we do that? I mean, it's one thing to have a what and a so what about inquiry, but what's the now what? What can I do? And so our community has developed and tested this list of 4 practices. And I think you'll find it very constant with NVC as well, and with other conflict resolution spaces. Maybe not Harvard, but most of the others. So the first rule, turn judgment into curiosity. Now, this one is really important for me because I love to be in judgment. I'm very good at it. But it also gets me stuck. So if I can, when I'm feeling judgment, if I can find a curious question to ask, one that truly is beyond my knowing, one that will shift the way that I see things, then suddenly I'm in flow again. I'm not still stuck in my judgment. It's not always easy. It's helpful to have a partner. My sister and colleague, and she lives downstairs, and she'll say to me, so Glenda, where's the curiosity in that? And she pulls me up short to say, oh yeah, I need a little more curiosity, a little less judgment. Judgment into curiosity. The second is to turn disagreement into shared exploration. Now, this one is interesting because if you think about disagreement or conflict, often, I don't know if you can see my hands. I'm going to stop sharing for just a second. So when you're in conflict, all the energy of the system is sucked into the space between those who are in conflict. No matter what else comes into the system, it gets sucked right into that vortex. If you can stand side by side and explore together what's possible, that doesn't mean that you're no longer in disagreement, but it does mean that that energy is being shifted to someplace else so that you can again flow and move forward. So what is it that can move into shared exploration together. And then you may go back to that disagreement and find it quite transformed. So turning disagreement into shared exploration. And again, it doesn't have to be anything big. It can be something small. What are we going to have for dinner? Planning an event together, doing some concrete thing that we can work on together reshapes the space. I was once working with an international Protestant church, and in a series of interviews, people would say to me, you know, as long as we're working in mission, we don't have a problem. It's only when we sit down and try to talk about policy and theology that we get all mucked up. And I said, okay, so don't talk about policy and theology for a while. Just go be in mission. That's a good thing. But it was because when they were working together in the field, it released that energy and kept it from being locked side to side. So that's the second. The third one, I'm going to go back over here. The third one is to turn defensiveness into self-reflection. This is so important with service providers because we have been working our whole lives to do good work. And that good work we continue to do. And when we see it's not working or someone tells us it's not working, when they say we should do it differently, my first response is defensiveness. But I'm doing the right thing. It's always worked before. It's supposed to work. And that again is a sticking place. It's a place where that wicked issue remains wicked. But if I can instead say, wait a minute, what is it that I'm really doing? What are the pieces that are essential? What can shift? Why am I connected to this? What can I learn from this process? All of those things of self-reflection then begin to oil the adaptive action wheels so that I can continue to move forward and shifting the patterns. Remember the vision C, understand and influence patterns to transform turbulence into possibility. And the fourth one, turn assumptions into questions. Now, this is one for sure you can't do by yourself because they are your assumptions because you don't know you have them. And so often this requires somebody else. In fact, I have had to become sensitive to the reaction that I have when someone challenges my assumptions. Because nobody says, you have this assumption, you need to change this assumption. I have to realize the kind of, well, I say it makes me itch. When someone says something that challenges my assumptions and I feel that itch, then I know, oh, that's what's happening. Red flag, red flag. What can I find about a question? But it took me a while to figure out what my cue was for assumptions that I was holding, because I'm so sure they're right. That it took me a while to find a cue to move forward through them. So I'm going to invite you to take out your 3 sentences again and to look at those 3 sentences and ask yourself, where's the judgment in those 3 sentences? And might there be some way to make it into curiosity? Is there some question you might ask? Where's the disagreement? And with whom? And how can you find a shared exploration around that agreement with that person in that place? What would that even look like to share an exploration with them? As you read the 3 sentences, are you feeling defensive? If so, what reflection do you need to have about that? And who knows what your assumptions are? And you can ask them. Who can tell you what you're assuming that needs to shift? So I'll give you just a couple of minutes to think about that. And going, of course, toward now what? So what's not enough? Keep going toward that now what? Okay. We want to make sure that you have some time to talk in breakout to share about what you've been seeing. So I'm not going to pause now for a group debrief because I'd really like for you to be able to talk in pairs. But does anybody have anything they're really burning to say in this moment? If so, we'd love to hear it. Just raise your hand. Okay. Take a deep breath. Ooh, wow. And the final tool that we're going to talk about today is what we call pattern logic. Now, when we say turning problems into patterns, and the question is, what do we mean by pattern? What does that even mean? How are we going to talk about and think about patterns? In the early days, I was working with folks in Finland, and I'd use the word pattern, and they kept talking about knitting. And I couldn't understand what it had to do with knitting, because when I say pattern, I mean something totally different. And I realized that the translation was literally a knitting pattern for redoing what you knit, and that you do it the same way every time. And so they found another translation, a way to think about it. But for us, a pattern is whatever is in that wicked issue that holds it together, that makes the difference, that makes sense, and that connects it. And so it's like the texture, it's like the photograph of that wicked issue in any moment, in any time. And that the research from this came from my dissertation, and my dissertation research in the 1990s from many different complexity sciences. It's deep and wide. We're not going to go there today. Where we are going to go today is one tool for seeing patterns that is quite useful. So the CDE model is the research that I did. So you can find out about it online, and we can talk about it some other time. But it's the deep and wide theory base that is uniquely HSD. But what we're going to do is to use a tool that's called pattern spotters. And pattern spotters come from soft systems methodologies, from Checkland. So it's a particular systems approach. We've shifted it for our use, but that was the source of it. So when you think about your wicked issue, again, take out your 3 sentences. I'm going to ask you to consider 4 different kinds of patterns in it. So the first one is in general. So in general, what do you notice in your wicked issue? So I loved your comment about procrastination. In general, I think of myself as a very active, productive person. Well, that's interesting. Or in general, I notice that this wicked issue I'm looking at has been around longer than I have and will continue to be. Or so in general, gives you a sense of the whole pattern. What is holding it together? What makes it a unitive item? In general, what do you notice? Now, this is not going to be a complete list, and it will probably be a biased list based on wherever you're standing. No problem. It's just whatever you see in general. That's the first question. The second question is, what are the contradictions in it? On the one hand, you did this so beautifully. On the one hand, I worry about procrastination. On the other hand, I'm a very productive person. Wow, that's interesting. On the one hand, My own experience gets triggered with this language related to guns. On the other hand, other people don't even hear the triggers, aren't aware of them. On the one hand, on the other, on the one hand, on the other. And this is beginning to unfold then what's the energy in the pattern. So the differences in a complex system is where the energy sits, like a battery holds energy. And so this begins to tell you where there might be some potential energy for change. The third is what surprised you. Have you been surprised by this wicked issue recently? And a surprise is really helpful because often those are the signals for new patterns that are emerging. They haven't come yet, but they're kind of on the horizon. So if you can keep your eyes open for surprises, you can often see what is coming in time and possibility. What surprised you about this pattern? And what are you wondering? And this draws you back into the inquiry about what you're wondering. We use these for many, many things. At the end of a meeting, to do a quick assessment of the meeting, we use them to evaluate complex qualitative data. We'll give interview results, for example, to 100 people, and then ask them these questions. In general, what do you notice? What are the contradictions that are there? What surprised you? What do you wonder? And it surfaces the patterns across. We use it for lots of things. Culture analysis. And this is a form that you can use to help you fill it out. Pattern spotters. Okay. So if you can't solve it, what can you do? You can do adaptive action. You can do the power of questions. You can focus on the rules for inquiry. You can ask the pattern spotters. So what I'd like for us to do, I'm going to check the time again.
We have about 18 minutes.
Perfect. So what I'd like to do is to put you in pairs. Yes.
I created the breakout groups, if you want.
Oh, great.
They're already
Thank you.
done. So.
And they're in pairs for 10 minutes. Does anybody have questions about what I'd like for you to do in the breakout is just to share what your reflection has been, how you have changed, and how your wicked issue has changed. Yes, ma'am, you have your hand out?
Well, I just have a quick question about,
Sure.
It seems like in all of this, like the space that you set up to hold this is really important because it's very different than how the world often works. And maybe I'm missing that, but if you can talk just a little bit about, because I think that's a challenge that I've had, is there's a, like setting up the conditions for people to get in this kind of space and for a long enough period is a challenge without getting pressure to go back to how things normally work.
Yeah, that's a really great question. The main thing that we do is to focus on a wicked issue. If people know this is a wicked issue they've lived with and they haven't been able to solve, and it still bothers them and they really want to do it, they've tried everything they thought they could do, then they're willing to step into a process. If they think that something they've already done or might do would fix it, then they don't want to do that. They want to go do what they think is going to work. So sometimes we say our clients are the desperate ones. So that's the most key thing for someone to find. In fact, it's more important that they see it as being wicked than that it be an important issue. If they're stuck and know they're stuck, then they'll come with you. And the other piece is to make sure that you're standing in an inquiry about it, that you don't come in with a solution that you're going to dump on them at the end. So you have to make sure that you're clean and ready for that. At least that's what our experience has been. Great question. Yes.
As a trained coach, this is a brilliant coaching model just for the individual coach that really needs to be out there, other than, from the larger organizational side. But my question is around this games. Can you just explain why you're using that terminology? Is it a metaphor that we're playing a game of some type, or games that we play with ourselves?
Yeah, it's a metaphor to try to make the patterns of these two things concrete and explicit so people can look at them. It's to project the characteristics onto something that people can look at more comfortably and more completely. There's no reason why games necessarily. There may be other things to do. Sometimes we use artworks, sometimes we use physical things. But the point is, as long as the pattern only exists in our conscious language, we are trapped in our conscious language to deal with it. But if we can extract it, put it on the wall, then suddenly we have more efficacy over it. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
And by the way, we just started this week our first ICF accredited continuing education program using HSD and coaching. We're going to be doing another one after the first of the year.
Oh, perfect. That's great.
It's very exciting. Cool. Anything else? Are you ready?
You know, Glenda, now we don't have that much time, but I'm just wondering, because we're so close to the end of time, and I know it's valuable that we get into a breakout room, but I'm wondering if we could hear from people collectively, like, I have lots of ideas because of this presentation. I was thinking for people who've experienced compassion integrity training, that it's so weak on systems that there's a whole element in what you're presenting here that would really help people understand not what systems are, but not necessarily, but how to work within systems. And so I'm just kind of wondering if people have ideas, if you have ideas of how we might interact with you in the future. And because I'm curious about that. I bet Olivia might be as well. I'm not sure, but I'd love to hear from people.
That's great, Marilyn. I love taking the now what to the group.
Yeah.
So all of you will go on with your individual now whats, but the group now what's. Great question. I'd love to hear. What's coming up for folks?
That same question came up for me. So I started this like thinking totally abstract something, and then it all became very clear with these last questions. So and I related it to CIT. So this is a great way of thinking about bigger issues and systems and how we can interact with it, changing that focus we might have from a problem to being more open questions and creating conversation. And so I really liked it. I really enjoyed this.
Well, if I could just say one thing really resonated for me, sometimes a word will jump out. And when you said, when you were first starting to talk about adaptive action, Glenda, and you said engage, and then you expanded on it a little bit. What came to me was that in this complex system thinking, through inquiry, once you get in, gauge. So those two separate things, and such an important element in a complex process is that kind of assessment right there, to stop, engage.
That's lovely.
Is this effective? What would be more effective?
I was wondering also, Glenda, when you got to pattern logic, I got so excited, and I'm sure that you probably have some activities for people to map out the chaos in their life and to begin the process of looking at the patterns. Can you let us know what that might be?
Yeah. So my research in complex systems says that there are 3 features of any complex self-organizing system. And those 3 features, they're like meta variables. So in particular places, there'll be different things that capture them. But by naming those 3 in a situation, it gives you a way to move forward. So if you know what those 3 features are, then you know how to, well, you can shift one, or you can shift another, you can shift a third. And they're something that contains the system, something that holds it. And you can either make that open or closed, more or less. Second is differences. So what are the differences that make a difference inside that wicked issue? What are the ones that really do? If there are too many, it's going to be really hard to see. If there are too few, then the system gets stuck. And the third is exchanges, how stuff connected. And so we have lots of practices about how you get good at seeing, understanding, and influencing those characteristics of complex systems. And one of the things that's really important, Marilyn, is that this works on social systems, on physical systems, on your own body systems, on your emotional systems, on cognitive systems, on policy, on practice, on process, and anything material or spiritual. Patterns emerge, and you can think about how to understand it now, influence it to become something shifted, and then future. Other reflections about ways that you might see this inquiry continuing. Yes, hands up. Mm-hmm.
I run the Charter Education Institute, and so I'm always kind of thinking about what we could bring on board that could support people in this work. I think I love that it's so simplistic and yet it's complex at the same time. So I'm just curious, and maybe that's a sidebar conversation around how we could bring that in, and whether that's bringing it in to work with cities. Could we train our own folks to do that? Do you have processes in place for that? Just curious.
Lovely question. Yes, we do. So we have a certification process, which is about an 80-hour process over 4 months. So there's an intensive at the beginning, and then practice and feedback in groups later. So we have a certification process. We do that open for lots of people to come, and then sometimes we do it for particular organizations. And I suspect that it would be useful to have people from the charter all together, because they'd have that shared background.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the certification. Then we do a series of what we call adaptive action labs, and they're 6 hours, 2 3-hour sessions online on particular topics. So I'm going to be doing one about systems thinking in November. Royce just finished one on facilitation. We're going to have one on diversity, equity, and inclusion, JEDI, in December. And so about every month or so, we have an adaptive action lab. We also have monthly free 1-hour live virtual workshops. I'm doing one this week, in fact, tomorrow, about decision making. So what does it mean to make decisions in these systems, right? You can't just stay in inquiry all the time. So it'll be about decision making tomorrow. We do custom work designed for whatever a client needs around a particular wicked issue or multiple wicked issues. And so it's an offline conversation for us to see what would be best to fit your needs. Online, face-to-face, we love working face-to-face. We also have a community of almost 1,000 people around the world who use this work in a variety of ways. No 2 people use it the same way. Everyone takes the work and embeds it in whatever their own practice is. And so we have a network of people who are applying it in many, many different ways and places. No one that I know explicitly who's looking particularly at compassion, but there are a lot of NVC practitioners, integral practitioners, lots of things.
I think the beauty of this work is that you really are very clear in your presentation. So that helps a lot. So, I kept thinking, oh my gosh, is this part of the, the chaos theory? And I'm guessing when you work like with a group, how many people do you feel comfortable in bringing into a session?
Great question. About the grounding and complexity. So there is on the level below where we're working, there are two levels. So one is the more kind of architectural work of human systems dynamics, and then below that is the theoretical grounding in many, many different threads of complexity and nonlinear dynamics. And so we go to various levels. So this top kind of practice level is the one that we bring to practitioners who are pained in their wicked issues and need to work right away. The second level we share with people who are going to be sharing and expanding the work, continuing to experiment with the work and expand it. And then the theoretical level is the place where we swim around with people who really want to go there. So we're also teaching a class right now that's called The Dragons of Complexity. It's about the fundamental philosophical challenges that complexity brings to Western thought, and ways that that's changing. How many people? So it depends. So we've done programs with 300, 400 people. Mostly that's around particular targeted tools, maybe particular wicked issues, and fairly short sessions, maybe 2 hours, maybe 3 hours. But from that, all the way to individual coaching work with individual leaders, where we go deep and wide with a single person. So we design the learning to match the needs of the learners in their contexts. We've studied, over the last 30 years, we've studied pedagogy and andragogy pretty deeply, because learning this work is very different from learning other things. It's more like a practice. It's more like learning to play a musical instrument or learning to meditate, because you never get done. You're never done. And so we call it a deep learning ecology. And so there's a pedagogy that goes along with it that centers on the learner. So what does the learner need? What does the learner know? What are the resources the learner is working with? And then we design learning to go along with that. Of course, we do have, as I say, these things that we've seen that are kind of general purpose, but we also create unique programs for unique needs.
Well, I'm really aware of the time, and I think that we're really grateful for you doing this. And I think if between Glenda, Olivia, and myself, we could meet just to kind of think about what the possible next steps are, I would invite people here today to let us know, what might be, having experienced this, what might be for you the next steps that you would like to take. One of the things that we have done in the past, we've mentioned CIT here, Compassion Integrity Training. We offered it for a couple years and have a number of trainers around the world who are up and ready to use the material, but we're in kind of a limbo right now with it. But nonetheless, I can see that people who are working in compassionate communities or organizations that are part of the charter would really find this to be very helpful. So let us know what you think we should be doing next, and what you'd like to see. And you can personalize it, certainly. So,
and for those of you who'd like to be on our newsletter or would like to come to the live virtual workshop or get its recording tomorrow, I put the email address in the chat. I may have misspelled it, info@hsdinstitute.org, and just say, please include me in the LVW tomorrow, live virtual workshop tomorrow.
Great. Thank you again, Glenda, so much. This was really wonderful, and we appreciate it. And maybe if Glenda and Olivia, if you could send available times where we can chat, that would be great. And I want to give a special hello to my former student, Darlene, who is coming to us very close to you, Glenda, in Minnesota.
Yeah. That's so great. Thank you all. Marilyn, thank you for this opportunity, and to all of you for the wonderful work that you do. So thank you.